All right, looks like a lot of people have joined and more are trickling in, so I'm going to kick things off. Thank you so much to everyone joining us today. As you all join this meeting and we get together to discuss the Ottawa River watershed, where many of those joining this virtual meeting reside. It's important to remember that this watershed is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. J'aimerais aussi vous faire savoir que le webinaire aujourd'hui se déroulera principalement en anglais, mais nous sommes une organisation bilingue, donc vous pouvez poser des questions en français ou nous envoyer un courriel après l'événement pour demander une clarification. De plus, la plupart ou la totalité de ce que nous couvrons aujourd'hui est disponible sur notre site web dans les deux langues. If you have questions during the webinar, and I'm sure there will be lots of them, please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We'll be looking at the questions as they come up, and then I'll be asking them on your behalf to our panelists at the end of the webinar. So if you haven't heard of us before, Ottawa Riverkeeper is a nonprofit and charity that works to protect the Ottawa River watershed. Earlier this year, we released a comprehensive watershed report card, a deep dive into the health of our river system based on 14 indicators. I'll throw a link to that in the chat in just a second. Some of these indicators revealed concerning trends and unexpected results. And we'll be speaking to many of these topics over the next few months at webinars just like this one. If you missed our webinar on the mystery of rising mercury levels, you can check out that recording on our YouTube channel. And our next one on October 17th is all about the impacts of nutrients. So make sure to sign up for that one and look out for more in the series by subscribing to our newsletter and following us on social media. Today, we're diving into the world of flow and how regular patterns seem to be changing in the Ottawa River watershed. To go over all the details of flow and river dynamics, we're joined by our guest expert, Dr. Pascale Biron, Professor of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia University. And to talk a little bit about Ottawa Riverkeeper's analysis and our data, we have Larissa Holman, our Director of Science and Policy. So Larissa, Pascale, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matthew. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are going to be talking about flow in the Ottawa River and many different ways that flow impacts ecosystem health, but also just how rivers work in general. So, and to once again, just to provide a bit of context, the Ottawa River watershed, the Kitchissippi, known in English as the Ottawa River, is located on the unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. The people of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation are the traditional and ongoing stewards of these lands and waters. Ottawa Riverkeeper recognizes the legacy of colonialism that continues to have a profound impact on the rights of Algonquin people, and that there's an urgent need for meaningful actions that truly confront this legacy. For those that are unfamiliar, the Ottawa River watershed is large. It's twice the size of New Brunswick. The river itself is over 1,200 kilometers long. Its headwaters begin in the Lac des Outaouais up on the northeastern side of the watershed. The river flows directly east, and then at Lake Temiskaming starts to flow, it flows west, and then once it reaches Lake Temiskaming, it begins to flow down towards Ottawa, past Ottawa, and its mouth is near the Lac de Montagne and the island of Montreal. As it flows through this area, there's many different differences in the river. So if you visit it in the Whitewater area around Westmeath or La Passe, you'll see really fast flowing rivers. But if you were to visit the river up near Lake Temiskaming, or even through the Arnprior area, there's areas of expansive flat water. And so it changes quite dramatically depending on the width and the slope of the river. Ottawa Riverkeeper, just really quickly, Matthew mentioned, we are a charity. We act as a watchdog of the river, and we really try to work across jurisdictions. We're part of a Watershed Alliance, which is an international organization. But as a governmental, independent, nonpartisan group. We really tried to bridge the gap that exists in this watershed, bringing actors from both sides of the river together to try and find solutions. We also ground our work with a science-based approach and look for science-based decision-making when we're speaking about what's best for the river. And as Matthew mentioned, there is this watershed report card that we released in May. It was years of data being collected and analyzed that helped us get to this point. The watershed report card is available online, and Matthew hopefully has shared it in the chat by now. So it's available in both French and English, and it summarizes the work that we've done around the watershed health assessment and monitoring initiative. Just to highlight that this initiative was looking at the ecological health of the river. There are 14 different indicators that we've looked at. There they are. And that we use a variety of sources for data to fill data gaps. We use community-based monitoring programs, but also just tried to bring data that was available from both provinces together to be able to form that analysis. And this one should say that it's flow. I guess I didn't leave it, but we're looking at flow today. So I'm going to pass it over now to Pascale Biron. Dr. Biron, as we've mentioned, is a prof at Concordia University. She's also worked extensively on a number of different projects, but her research involves river dynamics, stream restoration and fish habitat, sustainable management of agricultural streams, climate change, impacts on rivers, large-scale flood monitoring, three-dimensional computational fluid dynamics, and freedom spaces for rivers. She's published extensively and has great expertise on rivers, and she's going to speak today on how rivers move around and what happens when they're flooding. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Larissa. And you didn't mention that actually you were my student once upon a time.
Yeah,
It's great to hear and see that you're still involved with rivers, so that's great. So I'll share my screen, I guess, and show you if that works. Share, yeah. The PowerPoint, that should be here. All good? You're seeing it?
yes.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, I was asked to sort of give you a one course, River Dynamics 101 short course, explaining basic things. Sometimes we see rivers, but we don't always fully understand how they work. So I'll focus on the two main processes here that are flooding and erosion. Starting with, this is a figure that looks quite complicated and I typically show in my class, explaining that there are many types of rivers out there in nature, and there's a reason for that. It all depends on the slope, it depends on the size of the sediments, it depends as well on the amount of the sediment supply. And depending on where we are on this graph, at the bottom, rivers are said to be more stable, less stable at the top, and they're less stable towards the right. So when you look at the bottom left, where we have meandering rivers, then that's considered a stable form of river, and that's where we have shallow slopes, sediments that are fine. So typically we're in agricultural environments. The problem is that the word stability often is taken as a synonym of immobility, but that's not true. Actually, rivers will move, but when they're said to be stable, they will move in a predictable way, unlike at the top right, for example, braided rivers that are very difficult to predict. They really shift frequently, whereas meanders move in one direction at a time that we can fairly well anticipate. And if you take only two things out of my presentation today, it's these basic concepts of natural river dynamics, which is my science called hydrogeomorphology, is that these meanders, they migrate laterally. And we see it when we don't intervene, like on the photo we have here on the screen, and it's relatively straightforward to explain from a physical perspective, because that's due to what's called spiral flow or helical flow. that will erode the sediments on the outside of the bend and bring these sediments towards the inside in what's called a point bar. So that on the screen here, that meander will move towards your right in the future. So that's the first element. It, of course, means that there are areas near rivers where you'll have erosion, and on the other side, you'll have deposition. So people tend to be a bit upset when they're on the side where there's erosion. But it's nothing is lost, nothing is created here. There are people that actually will gain land with time that are on the other side. The other important element is that rivers regularly will go over their banks, will overflow their banks. Again, we tend to forget that and to think that rivers just not behaving when they're flooding, but what's called a bankful stage, when the channel is full of water, is reached on average every 1.5 to 2 years. So when it exceeds the bankful stage, then it flows into what's called the floodplain, and that's not that surprising. And it's always been the case in the past and will continue in the future. So floodplains for us, hydrogeomorphologists, are our fun areas where there's a lot of action. We tend to focus on the channel when we look at rivers, but when you look at this from a 3-dimensional perspective, there's a lot of things happening in the floodplain. These point bars that will eventually migrate, we'll have crevasse splay, oxbow lakes, former meanders, some fine deposits during floods. So it's, all that space sort of belongs to the river, but one of the issues is that typically, in reality, floodplains look like that, where people tend to live close to rivers. So then we have issues of river management. So the hydrogeomorphological approach is basically to say, well, bank erosion, flooding, they are natural processes. So not all eroding banks are a problem. And not all of them need to be controlled. Of course, we want to protect infrastructure. We don't want our bridges or roads to collapse in the river. But there is often a tendency to consider that erosion is negative, but there's a science out there that actually sees that it's a desirable attribute of rivers. For aquatic species, they need the heterogeneity provided by bank erosion. And increasingly, scientists agree that we should leave rivers erode when possible, of course, not everywhere, because that increases geomorphic unit diversity and is very positive from an environmental point of view. So in general, bank erosion, flooding, they're just a problem when urban or agricultural development restricts the space allocated to rivers. It's not a problem per se. So that's at the heart of a concept based on hydrogeomorphology that we put forward. I say we with colleagues in Quebec, Thomas Buffin-Bélanger and Marie Larocque from UQAR and UQAM, respectively, in early 2010, to try to look at that space around rivers called freedom space. It comes from France, originally espace de liberté in French. So to combine the mobility space and the flood space, and we've added to that the riparian and the wetlands, which from an environmental perspective are really important. And of course, accepting that when you have mobility, then the river uses more space. Of course, when you have major floods, the river obviously is using way more space than the channel. And this was a project actually in Quebec funded by the Quebec government and the climate change consortium called Uranos, with the objective of developing an approach to manage the Quebec rivers on the concept of freedom space to strengthen their resilience. And I've put this in red, bold here, of the river systems in the face of the increased variability and amplitude of discharge, and also the sediment transport associated with climate change. So we need to anticipate that in the future, we'll have more and more of these extreme events. So we don't want to be always reacting to flood events and erosion, but we want to be proactive through this approach. So leaving more space for rivers to flood and erode, mainly for public safety, that was the primary goal, but it also has, as I've just mentioned, environmental benefits. So I won't go in depth here, but what it looks like, it's a methodology using a lot of GIS, geographical information system, to map two mobility spaces, one that we call the short term, that's 50 years, so short term, not everyone has the same definition, but for hydrogeomorphologists, 50 years is short term. So that's in orange, and in yellow, more for the floodplain, mobility of the floodplain, longer term. And 3 levels of flooding, and most people are more familiar with that because we have flood maps, so frequent floods, medium or rare floods, and we also map these riparian wetlands. So when we combine them, that creates what we call the minimal freedom space in blue, so where we should really avoid as much as possible to have any infrastructure, and a functional space where in the long term we may have issues, but it's not as urgent to avoid development, and a third space for rare extreme events. So this is in the Quaticook region in the Eastern Township in Quebec, but that can be done everywhere. So the idea of changing the paradigm to look at floods is something that is really not just happening here and through this research program, but it's been ongoing in many areas in the world, because historically we tended to control rivers a lot, building dams, dikes, levees, and now more and more people are realizing, well, maybe we should in some cases let nature take its course. So you have here an example, and that's already 10 years ago, of nature-based approaches for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So there are a lot of initiatives across the world that move that way. Not to say that we should just remove all the dams and dikes, but that we should not solely rely on them. And going back to, this is similar to the original figure I was showing, but now with pictures, to understanding that there are different rivers, it's called fluvial styles, and we should not necessarily manage them the same way. We should take that into consideration. Here, I'll focus from an erosion point of view on the two in French. It's called divagant, wandering in English, where you have multiple channels and dynamic meanders that are quite dynamic, so higher risk of erosion there than in the others. The others being stable meanders and linear. There is braided, the bottom right there is highly dynamic, but in Ontario and Quebec, certainly in the Ottawa watershed, there are no braided rivers, so that's why I'm not mentioning it. And it's important to understand those concepts to better anticipate what might happen with rivers. This is an example in Quebec in the Du Gouffre watershed, that's in the Charlevoix region in Quebec, east of Quebec City on the north shore of St. Lawrence River. And this is a tributary called Rivière des Mers. And in 2023, in the spring, there was a major flood in that area. But if you go back and look at historical aerial photos, you see in 1927 that this was actually a wandering river, so multiple channels. And between 1927 and 1964, this river, for whatever reason, was transformed into a single channel. And there is a camping then that was built really literally on what was a river in the past, called the Garde-rivière. And this is a road that's quite important. It's Road 138 in Quebec. It's the only road going to Côte-Nord and Newfoundland eventually. So that is something useful to know, because in 2023, that explains a bit what happened to that bridge, which collapsed because it's a very dynamic river. And the river, in fact, went back. That's the camping after the flood, went back to its wandering pattern. Nature typically wins. So that's an illustration of how important it is to go back and understand the rivers. So I'll just provide a few points as a conclusion here, and we can discuss this further, but hopefully you got it, that rivers are complex systems, that to manage them in a sustainable way, we need to understand these concepts that we call hydrogeomorphological processes. That includes the meander erosion, the role of the floodplain, which is very dynamic, and understanding what went on in the past is really useful to predict better what might happen and what would be the behavior of these rivers in the future. And the major challenge, particularly in the context of climate change, is how can we now anticipate events that we haven't seen yet? The human brain is good at, okay, we saw that in the past, understanding that, but we're not particularly good at imagining what might this mega flood that we haven't seen yet look like. So understanding these fluvial hazards through the maps of freedom space is a way to help, because that gives us some idea of where the river might go in the future. So it's prevention rather than reaction to these major flood events. So with that, I'll thank you all for listening, and stop sharing and send this back to Larissa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to take a few minutes to present the data that we analyzed as part of our flow report, and then we'll open it up to questions. So this is where I get really great at not being able to do two things at the same time. So here we go. So the Watershed Report Card included background information that was the data that we took to analyze and come to the conclusions and how we reached the various grades for the Watershed Report Card. And so there is a report on flow data in the watershed. It is not yet up on our data portal. It will be later this week. And so we will be sharing that broadly once it's available. But I wanted to give a quick introduction to some of the findings that we found within that report. So to be able to do this analysis, we used data that was selected from the Water Survey of Canada, from Ontario Power Generation, and from the Ottawa River Regulation Planning Board. There was a limited number of sites that we could select from, despite the fact that there are a number of gauges in the Ottawa River watershed. We selected 17 sites based on the following criteria. They had to have at least 50 years of data, and they had to have an annual flow of greater than 10 meters cubed per second. The reason why we needed at least 50 years of data is that we wanted to do the analysis over 30-year periods. The rationale behind that is how the World Meteorological Association or organization does its analysis for climate research. And so to be able to assess climate variability and change, we needed to have data that was at least 30 years old, and multiple periods of 30 years. So they went from 1960 to 1990, 1970 to 2000, and to 2000, and then so on. And we compared those analyses accordingly. So you can see here in the map the locations of the various sites that we used for the analysis, and the size of the dots corresponds to their flow. The ones along the Ottawa River get larger and larger as more and more water comes into the system, and the smaller ones are typically along the tributaries or up in the headwaters. So there's a few different reasons why we wanted to look at flow to understand ecosystem health. I just wanted to run through those very quickly because we often think of flow as a water quantity issue, but actually rivers they are habitat to many different species. They're really important for ecological health of the river systems. And so understanding these ebbs and flows of river systems helps to highlight why this variability is important. So the first one is water availability and connectivity. River flows determine the availability and distribution of water resources, and this influences the hydrological balance. The second is water temperature. As there's more water flowing quickly, water remains cooler. Whereas if you have water that is sitting for periods of time, especially in the summer months, and when the volume of water is lower, the water is going to heat up a lot quicker. And so this can impact the temperature of the water and impact the species that are present in that. Many of the fish species in the Ottawa River watershed system require colder temperatures, and so they need to have pools or deeper water that is cooler for them to be able to thrive. Similarly, in warm water, plants and bacteria can reproduce a lot faster, which it can be a good thing. But if it's too hot and there's not enough water, then it just becomes overwhelming to the system. Also, when we have flooding events, we have this transportation of materials. Something that Dr. Biron alluded to is this idea that the materials moving around provides that heterogeneity to the riverbed. It also supplies new nutrients to different parts of the river system. It takes nutrients from the river and deposits them onto the shore. This is all really important for maintaining ecosystem health. And lastly, river flow shapes the rivers. And so when we have these different flow periods, they can carve out different spaces, but they can also really highlight what are the characteristics for the river system in different areas. And we see that quite easily in the Ottawa River system based on wherever you might be. Really quickly, I want to show a hydrograph, because this is what we expect to see in the Ottawa River system over the course of a year. And as you move from left to right, you'll see January to December, and there are specific periods of time where we'll see different events. In the winter, there doesn't seem to be as much variability as, say, in the spring months, so March, April, May. Even into June, we see this really dramatic increase in flow in the Ottawa River water system. In all river systems in Canada, when we have that spring melt, the runoff of the snow and rainfall events. And flooding is really impacted by that combination of snow accumulation and the timing of melting with rainfall events. And so this is from 2003. You can see the historical maximum flow in the light blue. And then the darker blue is what happened in 2023. But it should be noticed that there's this very dark bottom line that shows the historical minimum. And so these are the records on file. This is for Britannia site, which is just in the Ottawa area above the Chaudière Falls, that there can be really low flow events, and there's quite a bit of variability. And every year there's a certain risk factor for these higher flows and lower flows. Then what happens over the summer months is we experience warmer weather and the rains dry up, the water quantity really reduces, and you have this period of low flows. Again, this coincides with the warmer temperatures, and so it can be a time of year that is more of a vulnerability for some species, depending on how warm and how low the flow events get. And then we have this second sort of peak flow in the fall, when all the leaves have started to fall off the trees. You don't have plants taking up as much water. And so any rainfall that we're experiencing in the fall runs quickly towards the river systems and causes the flow rates to go back up again. And that repeats year after year. It's a regular schedule for river systems. So the way that we approach this analysis is that we relied really heavily on the work that was done previously by WWF Canada in their watershed reports. They were generous enough to share how they extracted the data from the Water Survey of Canada and some of the scripts that they used. And that was specifically for annual changes in flow rates. And so we used the Mann-Kendall test to try and see if there was a mononic trend. So was there changes that were happening over these periods on a yearly basis? We also looked at seasonal flow variability. So we specifically looked at peak flow and low flow events. So those periods in the springtime where the water got really high, and then also what was happening during the summer events, to try and understand what was happening in the system and be a little bit more analytical about what was happening over seasons and not just on a yearly basis. And we did this by using daily flow. So daily flow can be used to better understand ecosystem functions provided within a stream. We did not have data for all of the stations. The station at Carillon, because that data came from the Regulation Planning Board, it was only available on a monthly basis. And so we weren't able to do analysis for the Capianal station for all of these different pieces, but we were able to include it in some of the other analysis because monthly flow could be used. And so what did we find? Well, it was a mishmash of different things. One of the biggest challenges is just how variable flow is within the Ottawa River system. And so while I will speak of what we typically found, I'm showing two different areas. The station called HS04 is on the Des Moines River. And I specifically wanted to include this one. It's a bit of an outlier in much of our data, but it is the one river system that is not dammed on in the watershed. And so it is a free flowing river. And so it can help capture some of those different pieces that dams might not be influencing. And dams influence water flow in this system in a few different ways. First of all, in the spring flooding events, the reservoirs empty out to hold back water later in the spring once the areas in the upper watershed start to melt, and that is as an attempt to try and reduce the amount, the volume of peak flow. So while it can't stop flooding from happening, it can help influence how severe and significant those flooding events are. And there's been lots of reporting done on that, and happy to share some of those resources if people are curious. The other part that dams can play is around low flow events, because there are also recreational water heights at different behind different dams on the Ottawa River, and specifically I can think of how there's one just above Deyokum or Swisha. They hold the water to a certain height to allow people to fish and recreate above that dam. So that only happens during low flow events, and that water level is there to help maintain a certain water level, but that may be influencing some of the low flow volumes that we see. And so typically, what we'll see happening in the Ottawa River watershed is what's happening at Britannia, which is the HS12 site. Once again, Britannia is just above the Chaudière Falls in the Ottawa area, and it's on the Ottawa River. And so on the annual basis, the observations have been that there is more water in the system overall over time. That the spring season is, it is getting a bit higher, but also the timing of the spring event is moving earlier. And then that low flow events will have less water available in the system in low flow events. And so to quickly provide an overview of some of these pieces, there is the timing of the peak flow. It's hard to see on these graphs because you have to look at the various lines, but the other way that we've tried to capture this, and it's the red or the blue lines that you're looking at here, and when they start to go up. For another way to look at this is because peak flow typically happens about 3 weeks after ice off happens in the Ottawa River system. That's what has been happening. There is some discrepancy about when exactly this is occurring because they're not consistent throughout it. But overall, through our analysis, we found that peak flow was happening 0.8 days earlier over an 8-year period, a 10-year period. And the typical amount in Canada is 2 days earlier over a 10-year period. So things are not happening as quickly in the Ottawa River system, but peak flow does seem to be moving forward slowly. To coincide with this, to try and make sense of when thaw was happening and not just the heavy flow because of what's happening with the reservoir system, we took a look at what was going on with ice off. And so there's a large data set available through Ice Watch, which is a federal government program to collect data around when ice comes off of different areas or on different areas. So Bob's Lake is located in the Rideau Lake area, and Lake Temiskaming is the northern part of the watershed. And you can see these are the dates when the ice is the lake becomes free of ice. And you can see here that there is a very clear downward trend on both of these sites, which means that those ice-off periods are happening earlier in the spring. Coincides well with what we're experiencing with climate change. And then the trends in low flow, what we're seeing is that for longer periods of time in the summer, the water levels are remaining lower. And so not only do we have low water events, but they're happening over longer periods of time. With those warmer water events, weather events, with longer periods of low flow, we took a look at the 5th and the 10th percentile. And what we saw is that they were increasing for all of the different sites. The one good news piece is that in the last 30 years, they seem to have reduced slightly. The reason why this is so challenging for ecosystem health is because of those different pieces about habitat availability. With less connection in a river system, there's not going to be as many places for organisms to find refuge or hide, specifically fish, different fish species. It also means that the water temperatures are going to be more susceptible to becoming warmer, again, influencing a species' ability to thrive in a watershed, and making it more vulnerable to plant growth and to different types of bacteria growing. So it's something to keep an eye on. It's one of those pieces that we would like to spend more time better understanding, to try and understand what exactly is influencing it, because it is something that was seen throughout the different stations. Once again, on the left, we have the Britannia site, and on the right, we have the site for the Des Moines. And so it's consistent amongst those different places. The analysis we did includes a number of other pieces. This is just a really broad overview of it. We spent a lot of time explaining how the analysis was done and why these different pieces were looked at, and included these graphs for all 17 sites when available. And so if you are looking at trying to understand what's happening in your area or overall, I'd encourage you to take a look at the report later on. And I believe that's it on my end. But I'm going to leave up that pretty river picture for a second and turn it back to I'm going to start off the question and answer period, because I have the benefit of the person who's already speaking, and turn it back to Dr. Biron, because in your presentation, you spoke a lot about meandering rivers and the freedom space. And so I was wondering if you could explain how that might be applied to a river as large as the Ottawa River, or what might be happening in the watershed overall.
Yeah, the concept of freedom space was really not developed for rivers of that size. The Ottawa River or the St. Lawrence River, say in Quebec, that are really gigantic. I mean, we tend to forget it. We take it for granted because they're near us, but they're really quite large system. So all in all, the Ottawa River is a fairly straight river, with very few meanders, but many of the tributaries though, and I have myself, I often go to the Pontiac region. I have a good old friend there, and the Coulanges River area, and there are amazing meanders in that case. So yeah, the meander migration would be mainly affecting the tributaries, not so much the Ottawa River itself.
Right. Yeah, it was one of those things that, as you were speaking, how this might be impacting people thinking of like, oh my goodness, are we too close to the edges? Should we need to like retreat? But as you say, the river is quite straight, and it doesn't meander as much as some of those smaller streams. And yeah, there's some really amazing oxbows in this watershed if you happen to have a chance to go exploring in those areas. One of the major challenges that Ottawa Riverkeeper has highlighted in the work that we're doing, but also just generally knowing the fact that the Ottawa River is a provincial border, and that there's so many different municipalities in the watershed. these different authorities, these different groups don't always align on the best approach to flooding. And in your opinion, what are the risks of not having a shared approach for flood management?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Watershed management requires that the whole watershed works together, that you can take action upstream, say, that would benefit the downstream parts. There's an expression in France called solidarité amont-aval, so solidarity between upstream and downstream parts, that you really think when you do interventions in the upstream part that it might help the downstream parts. But in the case of the Ottawa River, of course, it's a shared watershed between Quebec and Ontario, about 2/3 in Quebec, 1/3 in Ontario. And in Canada, the flood management is a provincial responsibility. So that makes it quite complicated. I've seen many maps, in fact, of the Ottawa watershed on the Quebec side that just stopped at the Ottawa River, which is nonsense. Of course,
Yeah.
it's part of it in Ontario. There's, even within the province, certainly on the Quebec side, it's still clear which ministry even is in charge. It's a combination of the Ministry of Environment, Public Safety, Municipal Affairs. In the Ontario part, the conservation authorities play a key role. Not so much in Quebec. We have watershed organizations, but they are not really involved much, not to the extent certainly that they are in Ontario. So it really doesn't help. But I'm afraid I don't have a solution. In Europe, for example, it's truly watershed management, and there are many international watersheds, and it works, so it's possible. It's just complicated in Canada.
Yeah, in the reports that I've read about the flooding events in 2017 and 2019, both governments recognize the importance of working collaboratively, and yet neither seem to have found a solution on how best to do that. I'm wondering if Matthew might have some questions from people who are joining us online, because I'm sure
sure.
some time chatting about the challenges of watershed approach.
So yeah, thanks to you both for those presentations, and thanks everyone who's joined us for the webinar. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, you can hit the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen and ask them, and there have been a couple coming in. So let's kick things off with this one from Jocelyn, which is an interesting question. Are major flooding events, such as in 2017 and 2019 that you just mentioned, are those kind of events detrimental to the ecological health of the river?
No is a short answer. I mean, it's a perfectly natural thing for a river to flood. If you think of the Nile River, say, it's always been the case. And in fact, the floodplains that we live in, they were formed by the rivers. It's the rivers, the meanders eroding and the flooding that created the floodplains and the valleys that we are living in. So, and aquatic species are perfectly adapted to huge variability. I mean, between low flow and high flow, it's orders of magnitude. And in fact, some fish species, for example, require to have high flows for spawning. And so, the only environmental issues is when a flood will go through, say, an urban area where there are any garbage, any pollutants that may be then leached away by water that will end up in the river. But on its own, flooding is not a problem at all from an environmental perspective.
Great, fantastic. Larissa, I think you mentioned a couple things about reservoirs, but there's similar questions from Dan and Jocelyn about reservoirs in the north of the watershed being emptied. And the question is, should reservoirs not be kept to minimum levels before the spring freshet? So don't know if you want to expand on that and expand on what you mentioned already.
Sure. And, this is really a question that I'm sure the Ottawa Regulation Planning Board receives regularly, and I believe that they have some information available on their website. But just to review, the reservoirs are not located throughout the watershed. They are primarily in the upper regions of the watershed, and so they there is work that the planning board does to coordinate what's happening between the dam systems, the dams in the watershed. But what happens in late winter is they begin to empty out the reservoirs in anticipation of the snow melt and the rainfall that is going to be coming through the watershed to try and hold back some of that water. My recollection of what happens, and again, I don't work for those organizations, so I'm not fully aware of all of the different steps that they take, is that they have emptied them out to as low as they can in advance of the spring flow, depending on the amount of snow accumulation that is in the watershed. It's important to remember that flooding is impacted by a few different factors. One of them is the snow accumulation and the amount of moisture that's being held in that snow. But the other one that is really hard to plan for is the timing of the rain that comes in the spring. And depending on how much snow is melted, how saturated that ground is, if there is still ice cover or frozen ground, any rain that hits the ground at that time is going to run off towards the rivers and is going to result in the levels going up, the flow increasing. And so it's a step that the reservoirs take to try and minimize the impact of that peak flow. They can only lower the reservoirs so low, and they do this only so far in advance. And so there's a lot of variability and modeling that is done to make those decisions. And then once those reservoirs fill up, they no longer have the ability to hold back the water. And so my understanding is there's a lot of communication between the dam operators and the reservoirs, and trying to influence that to reduce the flooding event that might be occurring at that time. And so I'm not sure how much they can reduce it below what they've done already, and I'm not sure about the timing of it. But when looking at previous year's results, I remember seeing how low it had gone and how it had remained flat, like the flow coming out of a reservoir or the water level remaining flat, because they really didn't have any more water to let out. Reservoirs are always going to hold back some of that water. The level that the water can flow out of the dam has a base, and that's the baseline. So there will always be some water in the reservoirs. These are not tanks, they are still river systems. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it is a complicated one to predict, and it's done with a lot of modeling that happens to it. So it's a great question to send to the Ottawa River Regulation Planning Board in terms of what more can be done, and or if there is any more that can be done around that one. I don't know if, Pascale, you have any.
Well, I may just add, I mean, you mentioned it, but maybe to clarify it, it's about 40% of the discharge that is controlled by dams, only 40% in the Ottawa watershed. So that means 60% is just natural flow. So it's snow melt, rain, there's just nothing that can be done to control that.
And one of the things that throws many people off is there are very large dams on the Ottawa River system. Like I think of Schatz Falls, which goes across the entire river system. That's what's considered to be a run-of-river dam. So it doesn't have any reservoir capacity. What confuses people is often the fact that it does hold water back in the summer, but that's during a low flow event. And so there's still water flowing through it, but it's able to keep the water levels at a certain height because the water isn't moving as quickly as during the spring flooding. Once that spring flooding event starts to happen, often the dams just open up to allow as much water to pass through for those run-of-rivers, because they don't have the ability to hold back significant amounts of water. And so they can't really be manipulating what's happening below them.
And it's the same for the Carillon Dam in Quebec.
Yes.
And a lot of people in 2017 and 19 blame that, but there's just nothing they could do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you both. We've got a couple other questions coming in, and feel free to ask more if you have any. There's a quick question from Catherine about what we can do to better encourage more natural species migration around dams. And Larissa, I know we talk about eels a lot in this context, so let us know.
What can we do? Well, we can build eel ladders. That would be one for eels. Dams are not current, like there are very few dams on the Ottawa River system that have fish migration. So eel ladders are the only ones that currently exist. The only one on the Ottawa itself is located at Chaudière Falls here in Ottawa. There's a couple on tributaries, I believe, on the Madawaska River system, but there's really not very many. And so one of the challenges with fish migration is that dams do stop fish from going both upstream and downstream. Getting fish upstream is one part of the challenge. The other part is allowing fish to pass safely through a dam once they've spent their time upstream, because migratory fish want to be moving back and forth. And there is a high level of mortality for fish passing through turbines. There's a lot of work being done right now by a few different companies looking at how to allow for safe fish passage through turbines. And it's really good timing for these developments because a number of the dams on the Ottawa River and on the St. Lawrence are upgrading or replacing their turbines because they've reached end of life for their ability to function well. And so ideally those turbines would be replaced with ones that allow for a safe fish passage. And there are some that have been designed for smaller dams that allow, 99% of the fish to pass through safely, including full-grown eels in the Ottawa River. So that's both the upstream passage, which is, again, not an easy thing to install, and yet there are many different things that can be done to help fish move upstream. And for some fish species, like the eel, it's a critical part of their life cycle to be able to access these headwaters and be able to mature in the river systems. So those are so for things that people could do is they could remind elected officials of the importance of having fish passage at dams and put pressure on their hydro facilities for including fish passage when looking at refurbishing these facilities. Would you add anything, Matthew?
Just that if you're interested in Ottawa Riverkeeper's work on eel ladders and specifically trying to push for an eel ladder at the Carillon Dam, which is the first major hurdle that eels face, the major hurdle eels face getting into our watershed, you can look on our website. There's plenty of information there. We've been working on that for several years now.
We've seen eel ladders be very successful on some of the dams in Quebec and also the Beauharnois and the Moses Saunders Dam on the St. Lawrence. And so it'd be great to get an eel ladder at Carillon as well.
We've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get through a couple more questions. Julia asks if we can give an example of how changes to flow levels or ice on and off impact species life cycles. And adding on to that, how might climate change impact biodiversity due to these changes in flow or ice shifts?
I can take a start and then if you want to jump in. So changes in flow specifically that have to do with ice off is typically a trigger for different species. So it can be a trigger for species to migrate, it can also be a trigger for species to spawn. And so those faster flowing waters often let different fish species know that it's time to go and spawn in different areas of the river system. The challenge that can happen then is if there are fluctuations, or if there's an expectation for something else to be happening at that time. So another species or another resource to be available at that same time. As it shifts, it can make it challenging for those things to happen in a correct way. I'm trying to think of a great example, and I don't, but I do know that we did write a blog about this a while ago about how ice off is affecting species. I'm just not remembering the details off the top of my head because I only thought I had to know about flow and not about the species that live in the river in the same way. But it can, and similarly, you know, there are ice off. The fact that it's happening so early is, or so early in some areas is just concerning because it's also restricting passage over ice on the Ottawa River. We know from our experience of hearing reports about ice huts on the river in the wintertime that with the slushier, wetter ice, it's becoming harder to remove this equipment from the ice. And so even just the quality of ice across the river system is altering as well. And I'm sure there's a myriad of impacts that are influenced. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Biron, who's probably a little bit more eloquent about these things, but
Well, no, actually, I don't work that much on these issues, so I think you've answered very well the question. So yeah, no, I'm more on the physics of rivers, less so on the.
I have found that blog that you mentioned, Larissa, so I will post that in the chat for anyone who would like to follow up. There we go. And then finally, here, let's do one last question. And this is for Pascale, I think, from Jocelyn. With increased demand for hydroelectricity, how will reservoir and pond management factor in with freedom spaces and impacts on surrounding riparian infrastructure and properties and stuff like that?
Yeah, I guess the question assumes that new dams would be built, which I'm not aware of. I don't know if there are any plans on maybe the Ontario side, but I'm certainly not aware of it. It's increasingly challenging for various reasons. I mean, in the past, these dams, we appreciate them, the hydropower, but they have, you know, flooded vast territories for First Nations. There are tons of consequences, so I'm not aware that that's in the plan. Anyway, the short answer is that the freedom space concepts are obviously for non-dam rivers. Downstream of a dam, you expect, you know, some changes. There's less sediment transport, particularly, that will reduce their potential for mobility. But as I say, I'd be surprised that major dams that such as those that exist currently would be built in the coming years, because it really affects particularly First Nations dramatically.
Okay, fantastic. We've reached the end of our time. John, I see that you asked in the questions what happens to questions that aren't addressed. Feel free to reach out to us. You can contact us at info@ottawariverkeeper.ca, or just go on our website and find our contact form. Please feel free to reach out to us or through that or on social media. We're happy to answer questions about the river. So if you'd like any further information about anything we've talked about, just send it our way. Send those questions our way. So thank you again, everyone who joined us. Don't forget, if you'd like to join our next one, that's on October 17th. It's all about nutrients and the impacts of nutrients from urban and agricultural development in the watershed and how that is destabilizing the base of our ecosystems. I won't spoil too much, so come by and find out more. And thank you to Larissa and Dr. Pascale Biron for joining us and providing their expertise in their presentations. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.